Hi, I am Sherry Porath Rockwell of Sidley Austin, and I'm here on behalf of the California Lawyers Association Privacy Law Section. And we are co-hosting this CPRA Law and Tech series with the Future of Privacy Forum. This is our fourth installment on dark patterns, and I'm going to hand it over to Stacy Gray from the Future of Privacy Forum to talk a little bit more about herself and what we have in store.
Thank you so much, Sherry. My name is Stacy Gray. I'm the Director of Legislative Research and Analysis at the Future of Privacy Forum. We are a consumer privacy nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., but also all around the world. And very excited to be partnering with the California Lawyers Association on this series. We're into our fourth session.
I think it's fourth. We're in four. Yeah.
Fourth, yes, that was right. Session. We've been hosting these sessions every week on Friday at 12 o'clock Pacific time. You can catch the recordings of previous sessions and this session after we post it on our website at fpf.org/events. And each week, our aim is to bring in guest experts from academia, technical experts, business experts to explain some of the technology at the heart of emerging privacy regulation. So we'll be talking a little bit about the law today. So if you're here on this webinar, familiar with some of the new provisions in emerging state privacy laws around this concept of dark patterns. But mostly we're going to be focused on the topic. What is it that you need to know about the technical elements here and the business elements? What do you need to know as a compliance professional, as a policymaker, as a lawmaker, in order to understand the legislative piece, the legal pieces? So that's the purpose of the series. Join us again. You can join us for each of these. Next week, we will be talking at the same time, same place, about universal opt-outs and global privacy controls. So if that's a topic you're interested in, certainly of huge interest to a lot of policymakers, please join us next week as well. All right, I'm going to turn it back to you, Sherry, to introduce our fantastic guest speaker for this week.
Okay, and I will in a second. First, I just want to let you all know this is being recorded, so you know that. And then we would ask, we welcome your questions, but we do ask that you put it in the Q&A and not the chat feature. So please do that, and we may have some time at the end to answer questions. And so please do ask the questions. All right, well, it is our great pleasure and honor to have Dr. Jennifer King with us today. She is the Privacy and Data Fellow at Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, and she's a very well known in this area that we're going to talk about today. So I will hand it over to Jen.
There we go. Sorry. Thank you very much. Okay. So a little bit about me for a second, and then I'll go over what we're going to discuss today. So my background is in information privacy. So I've been researching information privacy for around 15 years now. I have a PhD in information science with a focus on human-computer interaction. And I've been looking at dark patterns for really a decade now. I began about 2009. I worked as an expert witness for the FTC on a case that was absolutely, in retrospect, a dark pattern. I've been working kind of at the edge of that frontier for a while now. And during that time, it's been interesting to see how much more widespread dark patterns have become online. And so I actually, just last year, I published an article that tried to take a deep dive into how I thought regulating dark patterns with the new California Privacy Act, basically how I think that will work. So I invite you to take a look at that piece if that's of any interest. It was in the Georgetown Law Tech Review last year, and I think it's available online. Okay, so I think that you will definitely have time for questions, because I'm not going to pack this completely full of information for all 50 minutes. But I'm going to talk through kind of what dark patterns are, what design patterns are, to give everybody a grounding and what the space is. What are they targeting? How do they work? The types of dark patterns that we've identified so far. And then everybody's favorite part, we'll look at some examples. And then I think, like I said, we'll definitely have time for questions. And Stacy and Sherry, as we go through, if anybody has a question that you think is really relevant at that time, don't hesitate to interrupt me, but I just can't see the Q&A right now. Okay, so let's get started. What is a design pattern? So what is the pattern part of the dark patterns discussion? And so at their simplest, design patterns are basically building blocks. They're these reusable elements that web designers, user experience designers, all the kind of UX professionals that design websites and web pages and mobile apps and such, those are the components that they use to build an interface. And so the example I have on this page are toggles, which we're going to talk about toggles a bit more as we go through, because I think that's been a core feature of CCPA do not sell opt-outs. So we'll dig into that a little bit more. And so, so that's the pattern part of a dark pattern. So the idea here is that we have these established design patterns that we reuse over and over and over again. They've mostly been validated through testing, although they generally don't come out of the academic community. It's much more of a practitioner thing. And so it's an area where we don't have necessarily like ISO standards or even standards from an organizational body like NIST, but they're more validated by practitioners who then kind of share that information online. And so a dark pattern, though, is one that takes what we think of as a kind of standard way of interacting and tweaks it ever so slightly, potentially, to get people to do what they may not want to do. But let me describe that in a little bit more depth. So there are a few definitions of dark patterns floating around, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them right now. So Harry Brignall, who runs the website darkpatterns.org, and that is a great one to check out if you want to know just the basics about this topic. He defined it as a user interface that has been carefully crafted to trick users into doing things. They are not mistakes. They are carefully crafted with a solid understanding of human psychology, and they do not have the user's best interests in mind. And so we hear that a lot when we talk about dark patterns, this idea that people are being manipulated, that it's for the benefit of the designer and not for the individual. Liguri and Strihilevitz this last year published a great article where they actually did an empirical study of dark patterns. They described it as techniques used to manipulate users to do things they would not otherwise do. Another definition that I like a lot, also published this last year. We're seeing a lot of scholarship on dark patterns right now that we haven't seen really up until this date. So it's kind of I'm not sure I'd call it trendy, but it's a very popular area right now. Dark patterns are user interface design choices that benefit an online service by coercing, manipulating, or deceiving users into making unintended and potentially harmful decisions. And so this is the definition I used in that paper I mentioned just a few minutes ago, because I think they break it down very clearly into coercion, manipulation, and deception. And so I'm going to dig into that more as we talk. And that animated GIF on this page is just an example of somebody trying to, it's not real, but the idea that you're trying to hit the unsubscribe button and it's impossible to actually touch. But let's talk about the CCPA and the CPRA for just a second. So both of those pieces of legislation have a reference to dark patterns. So the CPRA, which does not go into effect until next year, and as you may know, they are preparing to go into rulemaking and legislative process in terms of coming up with the regulations for the CPRA. So the CPRA has a definition of dark patterns, which, as I understand it, I believe it was actually taken from the Detour Act, which was proposed back in 2018 at the federal level. It has not passed, but both legislation define it as a user interface designed or manipulated with the substantial effect of subverting or impairing user autonomy, decision-making, or choice, as further defined by regulation. And I think the important thing to take from that is that it's not about the intent of the person or the company or the designer, whoever we center the creation of the dark pattern on. It's not that they intend, we don't have to prove intent, essentially is what I'm trying to get to here. It's not about intent, it's about the effect on the user. And that's how we try to evaluate what makes it a dark pattern. In the CPRA, it includes the definition, but the area that focuses on dark patterns is specifically on consent in this privacy context. And it notes that agreement obtained through the use of dark patterns does not constitute consent. So the real core issue there is how are companies or designers potentially influencing consent mechanisms in a way that get people to disclose personal information or agree to things that disclose personal information in a way they may not have intended to or may not want to. That's at least how I interpret that. The CCPA also makes reference to dark patterns. That's much narrower in the sense that it was very focused on these do not sell opt-outs. And so that language is: a business shall not use a method that is designed with the purpose or has the substantial effect of subverting or impairing a consumer's choice to opt out. So again, this focus on trying design techniques that make it difficult for you to exercise your choice or make it difficult for you to opt out when that is actually what you want to do. Okay, so where do we find dark patterns? I will talk about privacy quite a bit today, but they're much broader than privacy. And I think that if you look at the areas where the FTC, for example, has engaged in enforcement, you'll find that it's mostly in the e-commerce area. And it's mostly cases where the business model has been reliant on some form of dark pattern, and that there's usually a monetary harm. Obviously, in the privacy space, it's much harder to kind of draw a connection to a monetary harm. But that's why I think to date, we've seen the most action in this space in terms of e-commerce platforms that rely on dark patterns. But certainly we do see them in privacy, mostly around disclosure of personal information and consent processes. Another big area is attention in gaming. That's been in policymakers' sights now, I would say since at least 2018 with the Detour Act, again, proposed, not passed. And we have a number of bills actually at the federal level right now that are all trying to take aim at these different types of dark patterns that focus on your attention. Where are you spending your time? You know, are these different online gaming sites, gambling sites, or even things like Instagram that we've heard mentioned, I think, in recent hearings, like, are those things addictive? You know, how are they monopolizing our attention? And is that a dark pattern? So what I find is that for the most part, we often see these at decision points. So these points in your online journey where you are at the point of making a decision, often a time of payment, a time of whether you're willing to grant consent, that's where we're often seeing dark patterns deployed at a point where we feel like where the designer feels like there's a potential to push you, manipulate you, push you into making a decision that you may not actually want to make. All right. So let me talk for a few minutes about kind of how these work. And so as we understand this field today, we believe that what drives the use of dark patterns and our susceptibility to them are what we call cognitive biases and heuristics. So cognitive biases are defined as systematic errors in our thinking. You know, just the types of kind of things that we think all humans, and I want to make a point that we don't have a great understanding, I think, as to whether these are truly universal. The research seems to suggest they are, but I'm not sure how much the researchers themselves have done research out of a US and European context, just to kind of put that out there. But to the best of our knowledge right now, we believe they are cognitive biases, that they're just mistakes that we make in our thinking as humans in terms of how we estimate things and we estimate risk. For example, the three examples I have on the slide are the anchoring effect, confirmation bias, and the endowment effect. I mean, I'll explain one. The endowment effect is this idea that I could give you, I will give you a free coffee cup, and then I'll try to get you to trade that coffee cup for, I don't know, a box of cookies. And when they do these types of studies in a lab environment, people find that they will actually overvalue that free coffee cup because we call it the endowment effect. It was something that was given to you and you place more value on it. Even though I might be able to argue, hey, the coffee cup costs $1.99, the box of cookies costs $3.99. Like, from an economic perspective, you should take the cookies, or whatever rationale you're using there. Heuristics heuristics are mental shortcuts that we all use to kind of reduce our cognitive load. And so one of the things that I think we find in the online space is that it can be very difficult for us to make decisions and to read things. And I'll use privacy policies as an example, because I have a feeling just a few of you out there have probably written privacy policies. You hopefully don't have a high expectation that your average consumer has read them. You may yourself have trouble reading privacy policies online. And again, it's because it requires a lot of things, actually, both potentially a law degree and a high degree of education. But it also requires you to be in this mode that Daniel Kahneman has described as system 1 versus system 2 thinking. And that's where we're often in system 1, which is when we are able to, or we use things like heuristics, we use shortcuts, we use estimates, we use things that help us make decisions without having to stop and engage in this deep contemplative thinking. And yet something like reading a privacy policy requires what we call system 2 thinking. And that is the, like, I'm ready to stop and deeply consider what it is that's in front of me. I'll read every line. I'm not even sure how many of us are in system 2 thinking from day to day. It seems like especially the online world tends to pressure us all into system 1. But when we use heuristics, when we use these shortcuts to make decisions, it becomes really easy to potentially trick us. I think one of the most common ones you can think of is pricing. The fact that we price something at $1.99. How much is it? It's really $2, but it's $1. We price it at $1.99 with the hope that your brain will take the shortcut and interpret that as $1. I have an 8-year-old, and when I try to explain this to him, you can just see the wheels turning and like, well, why didn't they just call it $2? And again, it's to take advantage of that quick look. Oh, it's $1.99. I think it's actually $1, and you don't actually do the math. Okay, so let me talk for a second about dark patterns in the physical space, because really, to some extent, these are new, but at the same time, they're not new, and that we've seen this type of these types of mechanisms that take advantage of heuristics and biases probably for as long as humans have existed. But I think one of the areas that makes this the most clear is when you think about the modern supermarket. And so the slide on this, or the picture on this page, is it's probably hard for you to read in any detail, but it is a diagram essentially that decomposes all the parts of a kind of commercial supermarket and outlines in detail the extent to which every single part of that experience is designed and has been tested and has been thought about carefully to maximize sales. And so when you go into the modern supermarket, I mean, one of the most common things we think about in this context is, most people are going in for milk, eggs, those type of things that run out very quickly that are often needed in the household. And it's rare to find a supermarket that doesn't automatically always put those things in the very back of the store, because those are the things that people most commonly come in for: pet food, soda, you name it. You'll find those things at the back of the store because the expectation is as you walk through the whole store to get them, you'll be more susceptible to making decisions that end up with you walking out of the store with more items than you intended. And so this is, I think, a good template for kind of understanding how dark patterns transfer from the meat space, the actual physical world, into the digital world. But I think there is an important difference here, which is when you think about the modern supermarket, it is set up, it's optimized for you to try to make decisions that benefit the supermarket. But we're not at the point yet, I hope, where as you wander through the supermarket, someone actually, unless again, you go shopping with my 8-year-old son, somebody's not following you behind putting things into your basket. And that's, I think, one of the differences we see in the digital context is it's become very easy for some marketers to engage in that type of behavior. And that's, in my mind, a very aggressive type of dark pattern, where you may go through a checkout and not realize until the very last screen that something's been added to your receipt. And the presentation of it may have been minimized, so you don't notice until you actually, complete the checkout. So I think that's an important difference between kind of the physical space now between the physical space and the digital space, where it becomes much easier to take those very aggressive moves in the digital space than in the physical one. And yet it's interesting, I live in Berkeley, and even Berkeley has passed a law, and it might be the first in California. I say that I realize I'm not 100% sure, but I think it may be one of the first that has attempted to regulate actual physical checkouts, in the sense that because physical checkouts are often surrounded by unhealthy food, whether it's gum and candy and chips and all those sorts of things, Berkeley has basically said, you can't offer those things at the checkout, because we know that's, there are studies that demonstrate that's when people are at their most vulnerable, and when psychologically they're much more apt to go, oh, I'll go ahead and grab those Doritos as I check out, even though I went into the store with no intention of buying Doritos. And so Berkeley's actually tried to regulate that space by saying you can have healthy snacks at the front checkouts, but you can't have the cookies and all the high calorie treats. And so we are seeing some pushback against that type of design in the real world, not just in the digital one. Okay, so how did we get here with dark patterns? So part of what allowed their emergence, I think, at scale, and this is the difference I've seen over the past decade, is I used to see this much more in instances where it was mostly a case of deception. And so the dark pattern was intrinsic to the business model. And once you remove the dark pattern, usually something like a negative option continuity plan, for those of you in the consumer protection space, once you removed that, you cured the deception. The business didn't exist. The whole business was reliant on the fact that people were adding things to a cart or enrolling in some type of cancellation plan, and not knowing it until they got through it, and then eventually had to try to cancel. And without that, the business didn't exist. That's changing. We're seeing dark patterns at a scale and kind of embedded in different consumer contexts beyond just those kind of more clear edge cases where it is, out and out a question of potential deception. And so part of this is from A/B testing and the ability of websites to engage in just thousands and thousands of rounds of kind of micro testing, where they can put up like this slide shows you, 2 versions of a web page. In this case, basically what they're changing are the 2 main photos on the page. And then they can put that in front of any thousands of numbers of people and test to see what the conversion rate is. And that's what the graph is on this page. It's showing you that version A had a much higher conversion rate than version B. And so, logically, as a website, you would go with version A, and that's the version you would use. And so because we've been able to A/B test in the web space at incredible scale, I mean, it used to be that you might have to enroll users in a study, and you might be able to get a few hundred at a time. A company like Facebook, for example, can test millions of iterations of something. The big platforms can just do this at a massive amounts of users and get results that allow them to really fine tune the messaging, the presentation, where the button is on this page, where's the button on that page, and allows this optimization of what we think really gets people to convert, to sign up, to disclose, what have you. And so this has been a real game changer, I think, in terms of why dark patterns have become much more prevalent throughout society. Okay, so let me dig in a little bit deeper into kind of what makes a dark pattern. So I want to talk about deception versus coercion versus manipulation. Okay, so many of you, especially if you've done any work in the consumer protection space, you're familiar with deception, which is literally, the planting of false beliefs. This is lying to people. This is making a claim that's not true. And so we certainly see dark patterns in this space, but I think what makes this more of a contentious area is that often they fall into more of a gray area where it's either coercion or manipulation. Coercion is basically constraining your choices, making it harder for you to do what you want to do, but instead favoring the path that makes it easier for me to get you what I want you to do. Out and out manipulation is basically a hidden influence. And this is where instead of giving you the option, but potentially making it so that the option that I want you to pick looks more appealing, if I'm manipulating you, I'm just removing the option. You just don't have it. You're just going to end up doing what I want you to do because you don't actually even have a choice. And so those are some of the subtleties that I think really feed into trying to understand dark patterns. And also, I think it's part of the challenge in trying to regulate this area, because when somebody is being out and out deceptive, I think that's easier to make a case than being able to kind of unpack what's coercive versus what's manipulative. Okay, so let me talk a little about the different types of dark patterns. And again, I'm quoting from this fabulous paper, What Makes a Dark Pattern Dark, that I mentioned earlier. So first, asymmetry. And I think we see this the most often with buttons, which is, one big bright blue or green button that says, yes, do this, and a grayed out, much smaller button that says, no, never mind, I don't want to do that. So this is where the user interface is privileging or emphasizing one path over another. Second type are things that are covert. And again, this feeds into this idea of manipulation. Like, do I steer you towards a certain path that that you might otherwise not consider? And I think often we see this with subscription plans where, you may have a subscription plan that has one choice that's highlighted and, basically getting a hard sell on the interface, and the other versions are potentially, much less visually appealing or much less or they're de-emphasized in terms of what you actually are looking at on the page. Restrictive dark patterns, meaning you just don't have a lot of choices, or you're not given a full set of choices. Cookie consents, I think, are an excellent example of this, where, and I'll have one that I'll show in a few minutes, but where some of the earliest cookie consents we saw coming out of the EU were simply cookie consents that said, you have to agree. There is no other option. You just have to agree. We're just telling you there are cookies, you must agree. Fourth, interfaces that hide information. I think I see this a lot in dark patterns around things like negative option continuity plans, where a fee or a subscription cost or something like that is just not presented to you clearly. It's de-emphasized. Sometimes it's not even there at all. Or it's in a visual area of the screen that you wouldn't normally just look at, such as the footer or where the privacy policy is. So basically hiding information, and in many ways, this can be hiding in plain sight, as I put it. It's there, but again, in your kind of quick system one thinking where you're evaluating a website, you're not looking for it. And if I don't emphasize it for you, you're not going to see it. And then finally, deceptive, so again, this idea that things are just out and out deceptive. And there's another dimension, I think, to how these work as well, which is some of these are kind of modifying, what we call modifying the decision space, meaning that they're changing kind of the number of options or choices you have. And then versus the other, so actually, let me clarify. The first three of these, I think, modify the decision space. They change basically kind of the options you have available to you. Whereas the last two, hiding information and deception, those are actually manipulating the flow of information. They're taking the information you should have and either changing it, misleading, making it misleading, they're hiding it, they're just making it harder for you to make a decision. Okay. Time for some examples. So the first kind here we call guilt shaming or confirm shaming. I would be about 99% positive that all of you have seen some version of this. And these are the things that basically try to make you feel guilty for making whatever choice you want to make. The one with the bear, I think, is just great. You're using an ad blocker. We wondered if you might not. And the option, if you can see it, turn off the ad blocker, or I am a bad person. I mean, it's kind of funny, but at the same time, if you get that message repeatedly, I find even myself, like I find this kind of emotional struggle sometimes with picking these, like I am a bad person choices, even though, why? But we see this again, the bottom one, the option down there is no thanks, I want to pay full price. So again, trying to like reiterate to you, you're making the wrong choice here. You should absolutely unlock the secret prices. And then the other example here, which is a do not sell example, the wording on it is, I want to make a do not sell my personal information request. Note this action will make it harder for us to tailor content for you, which again, I think is just a like, here I am trying to persuade you not to make this choice, even though it's a choice you want to make. Okay, so false urgency. So these are the things, again, many of you have probably seen these as well. I have found that they have predominantly become, or they've become very common in the travel industry. That's not the only industry, but I think a lot of travel sites have adopted these types of pleas for urgency, which is simply, trying to get you to act now. Limited time offer. This is only going to last for 3 more minutes. There's only 3 of these things left. Occasionally, these are actually true, but in many cases, regulators have actually looked at the code behind the page, and you can see that these counters or these different types of kind of calls to action or urgency are simply untethered from any actual real code. Like they're meaningless. If you refresh the page, the countdown timer will just restart. it's basically deceptive. But even in cases where they are attached to a real example, so I've been seeing this on different types of shopping websites where they'll tell you, hey, there's 6 other people looking at this now. That's more of a form of social proof and not as much this false urgency. But again, it's this way to kind of like make you feel like, uh-oh, people are looking at this and maybe I better buy it now because this other person might buy it instead of me. So that's the type of kind of selling environment that they're trying to create. It's a high pressure sales tactic, essentially. Okay, cookie consents. So let me go through these really quick. So the first one in blue was what I had just mentioned earlier, which is all you get to do is accept. There's no choice. I think we saw these earlier in the life of the GDPR than we do now. My sense has been there's been quite a shift, both in terms of what regulators have said they find acceptable, and that we're seeing fewer and fewer of these. Although, in the US, there's no reason why you can't still show banners like that, but to be compliant in the GDPR, you actually need to give people real choices. There's a couple other examples on this page. One here is actually from a good colleague of mine, Stephanie Lucas. She's a designer at LinkedIn. She's a great expert on all things dark patterns, where she decomposes that example towards the bottom. This website uses cookies. What's wrong with this one? It's more that, again, you look at the 2 buttons, confirm selection or accept all. Accept all is already highlighted. It's purple. It's the natural thing that will it's screaming, pick me, if you're not really wanting to deal with this or thinking about it. And again, the choices there are extremely small and difficult to engage with. And so her criticism of this, again, was the tiny controls. And again, this button that's just basically screaming like, don't even think about it. Just pick me on the purple button and I'll just, I'll give you what you want, except it's what I want. The other one I think is actually a good example of a bad example. In that I think this one is just really confusing on its face. You can reject all, you can accept all. That's not so bad. It's the button at the bottom, the red accept button, which again, kind of screams towards this, pick this, don't even think about it. But the wording here is also just extremely confusing. Accept what? Accept everything? Accept, yeah, it's really unclear. But I'm going to decompose a few more examples like this in a minute. Okay. This is these are a couple screenshots from an FTC case, Age of Learning, against the company's Age of Learning. The software was ABC Mouse. And I think this is an interesting one because basically, as I understand it, what they got in trouble for was the difficulty in allowing their customers to cancel their subscriptions. And so first, on the first one with the mouse, there's a little bit of that kind of guilt shaming. Don't you know you can do this? Really? We have all these great benefits. No, thanks. Okay, I guess you want to just, make the wrong choice and cancel our service. And then on the final page, and again, I'm not sure how well you can see this, and I apologize if it's too small, but this is a version that we're seeing more and more pushback against. And that is the easy to sign up, hard to cancel. And so in this instance, I believe the only way you could cancel this service was to contact customer support. There was no cancellation button. There was no easy way to just end the subscription. They forced you to jump through hoops to do it. And, we see that I've seen this multiple times. I believe regulators are getting to push back on this much more clearly with language such as, it shouldn't be harder to cancel than it was to sign up, or the number of steps that you took in order to sign up for something should not, in order to cancel that ratio should not be highly out of whack. It should either be equal or it should take minimal effort to cancel if it took minimal effort to sign up for something. And so that's some of the pushback we're seeing with those types of cancellations. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk through a couple CCPA examples because I have a feeling that's probably top of mind for many of you if you actually work in the privacy space. And so here are 3 on this page that I've collected mostly because I find them really difficult to navigate. So the first one at the very top, the smaller one, you have this button that says agree or disagree. But if you look at this carefully, it's not clear what you're agreeing or disagreeing to you. Are you agreeing to sharing or are you not agreeing to share? It's just, it's ambiguous. And again, if you're not reading carefully and not stopping and taking the time to try to parse this, then, you know, most people will just stick with the default. And one of the things I haven't really mentioned yet today is, you know, I think one of the biggest challenges in creating notices like this is that, again, they're primarily written by lawyers, which all of you are, I believe, and for lawyers, which all of you are. And what you're not often considering in this space, but you don't necessarily have regulation that forces you to do this. But I will say, from my perspective as somebody in the usability space, I question, you know, why there isn't an obligation to make these things multilingual, you know, written for a lower grade level, you know, written for somebody maybe with an 8th grade education. You know, so even if we just focus, I'm mostly just going to focus on the toggle switch today, but I want to raise those issues as I think they're extremely important. And we've had lots of privacy policy related research that I think has identified some of the issues with privacy policies. And it's not just the general readability. I think it's also the inaccessibility to a lot of populations out there, especially in a state like California, that's so big and has so many different languages spoken. But anyway, that's my small soapbox. Again, the bigger one, I'm trying not to name these companies out loud, but again, you have sell my personal information on the site using cookies. And the toggle is, you know, I think on. It's blue. Maybe if I experimented with clicking it on and off, it would become clear to me whether the state is opt-in or opt-out. But the wording is just strange. And again, it's ambiguous. It's hard to kind of understand, what am I saying you can sell? Am I saying you can't sell my data? What is going on here? The bottom one is interesting. This came up just this week, to my attention just this week, which I thought was a little better. And I'm going to show you all an example I cooked up in just another slide or two to try to, like, that I riffed on this one to try to think if I could make it even more clear. Do not sell my personal information on this website or app. There's a toggle switch. The state says on, but it's grayed out. So I think it's on. Again, like, trying to interpret this, like, clearly, what does this mean, is really tricky with these. And so I think we need to have a kind of a reckoning as to what is the standard for how to make these types of opt-outs completely clear for people. So there is just no question when you arrive on this page, like, what is the state of do not sell? So here's another one. This actually, I think, comes from Windows 10. And again, you look at it, and this is a privacy specific one where, yes, there's this word off next to it, but again, is it actually off? Is it actually on? Like, how do you interpret that toggle switch? Again, just this kind of inherent ambiguity. And so this is so I worked this up actually just before we got on this this presentation today. So the very thing at the top, so I was trying to just piece through, like, how did we get here with the toggles and CCPA do not sell my personal information notices? And so for any of you who weren't following this process, at the very top, that blue icon, so that was suggested by some colleagues at Carnegie Mellon who were responding to the CCPA's requirement that there was supposed to be a logo that helped you understand your do not sell right. And so that's the logo that they had suggested, which I think helped introduce this idea of using a toggle switch in this context. And so the examples I put together on this page, this was and I am not a designer. So let me just say that flat out, I am not a designer. You don't come to me if you want something to look beautiful. That's not what I do. But I was just trying to decompose this for the sake of this discussion today. And I'll be curious to see if any of you have comments or questions about it, where I was trying to make, okay, if we're going to use a toggle, like, what is the way to make this the most clear? I think part of it is the fact that we are talking about this abstract concept, but we're not saying, you know, in a straightforward way, precisely what's happening to you. So I phrased it like this: may we sell your personal information? And the answer is no, do not sell it. Then the toggle is off in a grayed state with the word off. And if the answer is yes, you may sell my personal information, it's in the on state, engaged in blue with the word on it. So this was just my attempt at trying to piece through what I was finding very confusing about this space. Your results may vary if you talk to other people who were in the design space. But I do think this is a really big sticking point right now with CCPA notices. And just to add one more point, because I think the discussion was framed in terms of this kind of toggle discussion, what we're forgetting is that there is no reason you need to use a toggle here. I didn't have time to do this before this talk today, but I could have easily have used radio buttons here. So we could have had an on radio button and an off radio button. There's no special thing about the toggle here. Radio buttons or toggles could have been simply just fine, and we wouldn't have had to have this ambiguity. Okay, I think actually that is it for the slides. So I'm going to stop, and I look forward to discussing more about all of this stuff with you all. Okay.
Jen, I had a question just on the toggle point.
Sure.
To me, it seems like it's like OneTrust is almost like the standard setter, and they're using toggles, and people have been using them and or trying to replicate what they've done. And do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes. Again, it's true a lot of people are using OneTrust. I don't know anybody who works at OneTrust, so I've not asked this question to them. I feel like what I've seen is a vast difference in how they've implemented this feature for different customers, which I find kind of surprising. I mean, and it's not just the look and feel. It's not just like what color things are, the customization of your website to, the form or what have you. I've just seen wildly different examples of how that toggle button has been implemented. And so I don't know, but really at the end of the day, there's no reason it should be a toggle. We could have done it with an on radio button and an off radio button just as easily. So I don't know why the focus in toggles. Again, there were suggestions during the rulemaking progress. The OAG had come up with their own version, which was also a toggle button. And so I don't know if that just kind of ended up framing the whole discussion around this, or if there was just a sense that radio buttons were clearer and there were people who were less inclined to use them because they were clearer. Again, I wish I'd had time to mock up the radio button example so we could have compared it. But at the end of the day, though, one of the things I'm continuing to see is just these very ambiguous displays. And I think that we need to get to a point where we come up with a workable standard or workable guidance that outlines like, this is how you need to do it. This is clear. I didn't test this. So in a perfect world, I would actually test this with some users to make sure that my design made sense.
Another thing, I think many of us are drafting privacy policies. And while this isn't, I think the challenge for us lawyers is not just, and I appreciate the idea of bringing it down to a, 8th grader level, but it's the fact that the regulations require so many disclosures. Sure. And now will require disclosures across so many jurisdictions that are conflicting. And so to help your clients, you have to be comprehensive, but it's just, it almost, I wouldn't say it's a dark pattern. The intent is to comply with the law and do it how they say, but the way the regulations are drafted, CCPA, the charts that we have to use, it doesn't seem user-friendly. So how can well-meaning lawyers draft privacy policies, that comply with the law, but are more accessible?
Right. Well, I would argue that the privacy policy should be kind of bifurcated from what is actually shown to people on the website. And of course, I realize this can vary according to how many resources are in your organization. I am completely empathetic with in-house lawyers who are like, there are no designers at my company, or there are designers, but I'll never get time with them because they're being used on product, right? I think that's a known problem, but I do think that having worked at a large company myself, that there is a general sense that anything that is not a revenue generating portion of the company doesn't deserve attention. And I really contest that, not only from the legal side, where I think it does deserve attention, and things like privacy policies need to get improvement and love from user experience folks. also the whole customer care side of the house, which often, especially if it's a free service, just gets neglected from my own experience in that space. So, I think that I realize the translation of kind of the academic research I read into the more practitioner space is not always very straightforward, but I do think there's been a lot of work on like privacy policies specifically, and what could be done to improve their general readability, their presentation. I don't think that's too difficult to find at this point. But I mean, I think there's still some larger questions too around, what types of information is being disclosed, and what do we truly expect people to kind of understand? And if you're only disclosing certain features of information collection in the privacy policy and nowhere else, it's not like relevant to the context at the time when somebody's making a disclosure, for example, then I think that's a lost opportunity. Not that you need to pop a legal notice in front of somebody, but more of the like, oh, you're giving us your zip code, find out how we use this, the tooltip kind of idea, if that makes sense, just as a random example.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, no, mine just was like almost like focused on the regulators. Like, if this is a problem, like stop making us lard up these policies with all these disclosures.
Sure,
it's across. You're working at cross purposes in a sense.
Well,
we have to protect our clients by following the regs. So
I would also argue that the public sector suffers from a lack of technical expertise from, folks like me, computer scientists and others. And so I've long been an advocate of trying to get more people with design backgrounds, user-centered design, HCI research into the public sector so that they can help make better informed decisions and drive, more reasonable guidelines. Because I absolutely agree with you, because your fellow lawyers in the regulatory space also don't have that training. And so they're coming at it from I think more is better version, or more is better interpretation in terms of like what you can disclose to people. But it's not user-centric.
Agree, incredibly important. We have a bunch of people on the call. We'd love to give people a chance to think about everything you've just presented, ask some questions. We've got one so far, which I'll share with you. And for the benefit of folks that are on the phone and maybe can't see the Q&A, one participant asks, is there a way to test for dark patterns at scale? So some of this has been done. So we're familiar with some researchers at the Princeton Center for Information, Privacy and Technology, I believe, CIPT, have done this. Can you describe how that works? We got a couple of thumbs up on that question. People are very interested.
Right. Well, so I think it's a question of, can you test from outside the company for these things at scale? Because certainly if you're a large platform and you're designing your own dark patterns, you can test how well they work. So that's no question. It's how do researchers like me test for dark patterns at scale? And yes, some of my colleagues at Princeton have been on I would say the cutting edge of trying to figure out how to do this. And part of it's been, they did a huge crawl of online shopping sites, and we're actually able to grab the HTML code and look at different elements of the code that were used to interpret whether they thought that the companies were using a dark pattern. I apologize that I can't explain it more clearly than that. But if you do a search for like Princeton dark patterns scale, I think you'll get the result. They have actually a very nice website where they describe the project, and they have a link to the paper, and as well, they also have a link to the data set. So there have been attempts to do this. And so again, they did it by looking at code, which is a really interesting approach. I've always assumed that you had to actually look at the visual design. So that's why that study was kind of a real eye-opener to me personally. So that gives me a chance to say, at Stanford, we're now hosting a website called the Dark Patterns Tip Line, and it's darkpatternstipline.org, where we are taking in submissions and reviewing those submissions of different dark patterns that people find in the wild. And one of the goals of that website is to create a corpus of examples of dark patterns. And so those will primarily be screenshots. Now, how we go from a screenshot or a set of screenshots into actually decomposing those things and measuring them will be an interesting challenge from the research perspective. I think it's very possible that we could use AI to do this in terms of using training an AI or training a machine learning algorithm on the visual composition of those screenshots. So, and I think you could potentially, that would be potentially one way to do it at scale. I mean, in the old fashioned way is to literally have graduate students or other folks that you hire to label, and interpret different screenshots to try to figure out, okay, is this a dark pattern? Is this not a dark pattern? But this is one of those areas where I think we could actually use AI to potentially, build off the examples we have and then potentially find a way to actually look at other examples in the wild.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Jen. And thank you to the participant who sent me the link. I've shared it in the chat for everyone to the Princeton Dark Patterns website that you're describing. One of the things, if I'm remembering correctly, I don't want to mischaracterize that, but I recall one of the things they looked at was JavaScript that pops up an automatic countdown timer.
Right.
So that is not tethered to any kind of real time frame. It's just that any user who visits that site sees the same thing. Oh, exactly. 10 minutes left, even though that's personalized and not a real countdown, so to speak. So that's the kind of thing you could look for in website code, for instance. Right. Some of the more sophisticated stuff, maybe not.
Yeah, let me just add one more point on that, which is that I think it highlights an interesting issue, which is your ability to go out and find dark patterns that everybody sees. Everybody's seeing the same dark pattern. What it won't tell you are personalized dark patterns. And I don't yet know how much we are in the territory of highly personalized dark patterns, but it does concern me that we are moving into that space, because there are certainly ways, we all know, I mean, we know this from targeted advertising, but there's many ways that a site can personalize your experience such that, I may get a blue version of a checkout and Stacy gets a green version of the checkout. And, we're being given those different versions because an algorithm has made a judgment that I'm more susceptible to something that's blue than green. And with Stacy, it's the opposite. And so that's a level of kind of dark patterns in design that's not necessarily a single UI element, but a whole sense of personalization that concerns me, that we may see at different decision points in the future. The idea that we all have the same checkout experience might be diverging.
So I know this isn't illegal. We're focused on the technology more, but I think it would be interesting to understand the extent to which regulators are trying to coordinate to I mean, you're thinking this is a dark pattern on darkpatterns.org, but what are the again, I'm just looking at this from the viewpoint of a lawyer trying to help their clients comply, and where it's not intentional, where it doesn't appear, at least to us, to be intentional, but they're just maybe trying to distill complicated concepts and choices that they offer into some kind of user-friendly thing that also just in the best way they can, right? So yeah, I guess the question is, it's kind of like, how do we know? You'll know it when you see it, or is there coordination with regulators to try to come up with almost like a uniform code or something? Or
that's
is that even possible?
Yeah, no, and that's something I'm personally pushing for, honestly. Not that I can do it on my own, but I'm advocating for that, because yes, I mean, I think that it's something where we need to see not just national cooperation, but international cooperation. These things definitely span geographic boundaries. It's not just about the US, it's also about the EU. I don't have a good sense of how we see them manifest in like China, for example, but I know there is interest in the topic even there. Of course, just language issues may kind of change how some of these things are interpreted. There might be cultural context changes, but just the short answer is yes, I agree. I think there needs to be guidance, especially on the gray areas, because the gray areas are really tough. And I will tell you that now that we've been working with this dark patterns tip line, we took it over in December, and I've been working with students to help kind of establish a standard for reviewing these things over the last few months. It's tricky. It's really tricky in some cases to just try to evaluate something and to really think about, okay, what is going on here? And is this a dark pattern? Or is this somebody who just doesn't like the design or doesn't like the outcome of it? which is different to me than being, potentially manipulated into a position. And so I agree that these are really thorny issues. And I also think that businesses need guidance, because I think navigating this on your own can be really challenging.
Yeah, Jen, I agree. So you mentioned sort of somebody just doesn't like the outcome, but it might not be a dark pattern. I might point out the opposite, where there might not be a cognizable harm, but people don't like the lack of choice. People are responding against the lack of autonomy. One of the things that I found remarkably challenging about this space is how difficult it is to consider dark patterns in the absence of context, especially with some of these new legislative definitions that just talk about limiting choice, for example. And maybe it's more of a theoretical question, because those new laws are really about limiting choice in the context of consent. But big picture, we limit our choices in lots of ways all the time, right? I might download an app specifically to manipulate me into working out more, or manipulate me into learning a new language or something, right? By taking away my choices and harassing me with pop-ups and things like that. You could argue there's kind of like a meta choice, in the sense that I've chosen to download that and put myself through that process. But how do you think about context when you think about this? A lot of companies will argue there needs to be some harm. Does the context matter? And I'll throw one more at you, because this also gets to one of the questions that's in the Q&A right now. Is it useful to separate out cookie banners from the rest of the world of dark patterns? Because one of the things that strikes me about cookie banners is that the context of a banner at the bottom of a website, where you're just trying to get to that website, really doesn't lend itself to deliberate, slow, informed choice. Whereas in almost any other context, you might be able to build that. It's very different from shopping on a retail website. Anyway, big picture question: context, and separating out cookie banners as kind of their own world, where one might argue choice is never fully possible.
Wow.
That's just
context matters, but I think that there are examples that span context. And as I think about that, it's the kind of emphasizing one choice or another that comes to mind. It's the, accept button versus reject button. I can put that in many different contexts, but it can still potentially be a dark pattern, whether it is a, it's a health site versus an e-commerce site, what I mean? And so I think there are some. I don't know if they're all universal. I mean, I think the example you gave really thinks about attention, and attention is a dark pattern. And I think there's a question in the Q&A too about gambling sites in particular, and gaming. And so, I think where it becomes challenging too is this kind of attention space. And you're right that I think there can be a difference between the areas where I have elected to have something engage with my attention, and the areas where maybe something is intruding on my space and trying to force itself into my space. And I think that is one of the harder parts about gaming. And the interesting thing about the attention space right now is that I feel like it's just starting to get attention from the addiction community. And that to date, there's not been a lot of folks who have experience with actual addictive behaviors or addictive psychology looking at gaming and online other types of dark patterns. I think we're just at the beginning of people starting to take notice and go, oh, this is a legitimate research area. And part of that's dictated by research funding as well. And so once we see policy take hold, we may actually see research money kind of chasing that as well. But just to say, I'm sorry, this is a long answer with several divergent pieces in it. I apologize. But if you take the idea of something like gaming, I think where the attention concerns come in is the kind of imbalance between situations that allow for natural pauses or natural breaks versus contexts where you create this kind of perpetual loop that becomes all completely dependent on you to stop. So like Instagram has come up, I think, in this discussion quite a bit, especially with kids. And you could imagine, ideas, I mean, and some of the ideas that I think that are coming out in legislation are these interventions like nudges or timers, and you even see this with most of the products I use are Apple products, but Apple has these different screen time things that aren't just for kids now, they're for adults that allow you to say, hey, I want to turn off my computer at 10 o'clock at night, or hey, I need to recognize that I shouldn't have 6 hours of screen time every day. So I mean, some of this I think is just beginning to come in to help us understand where some of these different apps and websites and services have been designed to optimize attention and gain for the company or the maker at the complete expense of the user, and that there may need to be areas where we begin to say, wait a second, like, the same thing with kind of online gambling, or not online gambling, I'm sorry, like gambling in physical spaces, that, you may actually have to put in, areas where people have to like stop, or allow for, people to kind of stop problematic behaviors, or recognize that not everybody can just say no, and that you need to maybe build features into these things that allow people to set some guardrails. Okay, that didn't at all talk about cookies. I'm not sure I can answer the cookie question, honestly.
That's okay. I'm not sure I can answer it. And we have so many more questions.
Yeah.
Actually, one of them kind of related to that is somebody asked if there are any advertising industry associations that are working on best practices guidance. I haven't seen any, which is not to say they aren't out there, but my sense is that most of the push on this is coming from regulators. Do you think so, Jen?
Yeah,
in the
I
EU
haven't seen any.
in the US. Yeah.
And thank you, Alma, for that question. Hi, Alma.
It's a great question. One person would like you to sort of dig in a little more on the line, double click, if you will, on the line between persuasion and impermissible dark patterns.
Right. Yes. So I didn't go into that much in this this talk today, but this question of like what's permissible in terms of persuasion and what's impermissible. And I think it's a really tough one, because if you look at the US and consumer protection, we pretty much have a very hands-off approach when it comes to marketing, up until the point where you cross the line of deception. And at that point, if you're actually planting false beliefs, making false claims, then you're in trouble. But you can go pretty far up to that line, at least in terms of marketing, before you trigger an actual regulatory response, right? And I struggle with this one because, again, there's not a clear, the regulatory space to me is not all that clear. And I've been trying to think, like, what does that mean in terms of our online experiences? Does it mean that, what I think it could mean is that when we're at those decision points, when we're at the point where we have to make a choice, that's where I think regulators are beginning to say, maybe we need to step in and make sure that when people have to make decisions, that those decisions are now kind of protected in a way that doesn't allow for them to be overloaded or over persuaded. And so, what does that actually mean? One of the things I've thought about for a while is this idea of a more neutral interface. And this is not something I've discussed with other researchers, so I don't have a really good read on if other people kind of in my field would say there's, forget it, you can't create a neutral interface. I'm not willing to say no at this point, but I do think, let's take the online checkout, for example. Like, you could imagine in an online experience that has a lot of kind of persuasive elements, but when you get to the checkout, when you are there to make the decision about what to buy, that to some extent you're in a regulated and protected space, like that you can't necessarily give people many different checkouts, or you can't give people checkouts based on personal information other than perhaps, like, if I have some type of disability, like a visual disability, maybe then I get a different version of the checkout because that will actually help me as somebody who has a visual disability. But that the checkout itself can no longer have like ads in it, or countdown timers, or there are clearer rules around disclosure of fees, for example. And so, and again, that maybe it's consistent, that we don't get we're not going to use A/B testing in the checkout and like give everybody a different version of it. So that's where I could imagine trying to think about these decision points, and or maybe in these attention spaces, attention dark pattern spaces, thinking about including kind of decision points, because I think I've just begun to look into online gaming a bit recently. And one of the things that I think of from the dark patterns perspective that concerns me is that, some of the examples we've seen are games that have no natural endpoint. They just go and go and go and go, which I, can contrast very concretely to being a child of the 80s and putting a quarter in an arcade, and you have a very, set time to play a game and it ends. And then you have to make the decision if you're going to replay or you run out of quarters. There's something about that kind of forced like end to the continuity that makes you stop and go, oh, maybe, well, I'm out of quarters, I should go use the bathroom. I should just stop playing the game. And so I do wonder about, I could imagine, especially in the kids context, and I think we've seen this even in China, where they've put just strict limits on how many hours a day kids are allowed to play games. It wouldn't surprise me if we potentially see some interventions like that, at least with kids, in terms of recognizing that if the player is under the age of 18, you can't have it infinitely cycle. Like, you have to give them the option to say continue, yes or no. I mean, even that's subtle, but that could be enough to get somebody to actually pause and kind of assess, maybe I should go use the bathroom instead of playing for 3 more hours.
I'm so glad you raised that arcade example, because it's one that I've been thinking a lot about too. Were we just subject to dark patterns in the 80s with arcade games? Perhaps is the right answer. But aside from the time element that you mentioned, there's also the design element of designing a game such that it forces you to continue, such that it never ends, it gets harder, it gets so hard that you cannot complete it without either paying to re-up levels or paying for special powers in the game or special tools in the game or special weapons. That kind of game design, how do you think that fits in to this? Because in a sense, that is kind of how the arcade games in the 80s worked, but not really, right? So
right, and I say that with the aforementioned 8-year-old, in that space coming to me, can I buy this virtual good? No, you can't buy the virtual good. And so, yeah, I'm his least favorite person in those moments. I mean, I think so. Some of this is informed by having worked on a past case where the ability for kids to buy virtual goods or make virtual purchases in the gaming environment was unrestricted, and that led to some extreme charges for parents in the thousands of dollars a range, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'd say clearly there have to be some guardrails in terms of what kids are even allowed to do, period. But the whole model, I mean, I think there have been some really egregious guilt shaming versions of online apps for kids that I mean, honestly, I don't know how much uptake they get ultimately. I'm not sure if it's a strategy that ends up backfiring, short of the scenario where there's a distracted parent who's just like, go ahead, keep playing, I don't care, or I'll, pay for it and I'm not, you get X amount of money and you can just keep playing. I mean, I would have to say as a parent, I get annoyed by the constant requests for, can I buy this Minecraft skin? Can I buy this thing? But I'm glad that he can't do it without asking me. Do I wish that there were games that I just bought and there were no things to unlock? I mean, yes, as a parent, I look for those things, but there are not very many. And I find that really disappointing, which I would say means there's a space there for game companies to potentially innovate. Because a lot of us, I will often just refuse to allow those games at all, because I think of them as just so that constant cycle of, have to buy this, have to buy this, have to buy this. I'm just like, I don't want to deal with it.
Totally understandable. Jen,
sorry if that was an over personal answer to that question, but I'm living it.
It's a highly sympathetic one.
We can all relate. I think it's very relatable, and I think it's a huge struggle. I think it's not insignificant.
Sherry, I'm gonna, unless you have a final question, I think there's a really interesting one, and I'd like to maybe wrap up by asking you, Jen, about the role of culture, disability, age, demographics, all these things in terms of testing the effect of dark patterns on different people and understanding them generally. So while you think about that specifically, the specific question is from a participant, would it make sense for, say, a marketing department of a company to test for whether a large portion of its customers are non-English speakers? And if so, to invest in multilingual privacy policies? Seems like this would be a beneficial investment. Yeah, especially in diverse states like California, should it be required? So thoughts on that, and also the broader question of demographics and age and all these different factors.
Yeah, I realize I'm going to say these things, and I know that those of you who are privacy lawyers are probably going to want to come after me with spears. So I'm sorry in advance. Well, and it just, so I'll just make one quick plug. I have a whole white paper on this topic that I wrote with the World Economic Forum, the local San Francisco office, on notice and consent and alternatives, because in short, as long as we have notice and consent, and that is our primary way that we communicate to people, then there are I have a laundry list of problems with it that I can go into. And I do think we need to move past notice and consent. So I'll just make that plug and say the white paper goes into that if you're interested in it all. But I think some of the problems with notice and consent are some of the things you've just talked about, that there've never been requirements around dealing with all sorts of different kind of demographic factors, whether it's that that you have a large Spanish speaking audience or customer base here in California, and you don't offer the policy in Spanish. I mean, when I was doing my in 2020, I spent several months with a handful of Stanford undergrads looking at different do not sell my information opt-outs, and we found Chinese speaking grocery stores that didn't offer them in Mandarin. So there are some obvious ones that I think, if that you have a very large, Mandarin speaking or Spanish speaking population, then you should absolutely be thinking about it. But that said, it's the good old lipstick on a pig analogy. It's like you're still, if you're taking the long legal notice and translating it, I'm not ultimately sure what you're gaining in terms of communicating to customers. And I think there's a good question in the Q&A that I see here too about just-in-time privacy notices, which is this idea of just giving you the little bits as it's relevant and not giving you the whole enchilada, as it were. And again, I do fall on the side of I think just-in-time is better in terms of being relevant and salient to decision-making. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't still make a version available to people that allows them to kind of look up a broader set or kind of understand the bigger picture. But I do think, and actually Lior Strahilovitz's paper from University of Chicago, which I really do recommend, he has done one of the first kind of empirical tests of dark patterns, and he did find interesting results that kind of implicated, I think, education levels off the top of my head, maybe age, but I think it was more education based, like differences in how people interpreted them, with the outcome being that the less education you had, the more you were potentially susceptible to these things, which I think that doesn't surprise me, but we just haven't seen any research yet that really explores those type of effects. So I do think we really have to be mindful of those. Whether it's that we want to be good citizens and thinking about equity, or that policymakers decide, hey, you need to make sure that these are translatable in the 8 different languages that you serve, and they need to also be more consumer friendly. I do think those are all really, as long as we double down on notice and consent, I think these are all really, thorny issues that I'm sure a lot of you have not wanted to deal with, but I think, could potentially be on the horizon.
Well, CCPA regs, just to put a plug, they do require, if a business offers sale notices or communicates with their customers in a certain language, then they have to make the policies available in that language. So in a way, it's a proxy for if a large percentage of your customers, if that's their primary language or you're communicating with them in that language, then you need the notices and the policy in that language.
Right.
Good.
Unfortunately, when I was doing this work, which was 2020, so I think it was still pretty recent, it was clear that not all businesses in California who had that requirement were fulfilling it. may
Yeah,
have
no,
changed,
not to
though.
say it's fulfilled, but the aspiration is there. Yeah, yeah. Oh, it's one way of doing it. That's all I'm saying, right, from the regulatory perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you are correct, Jen, that this is a not trending hot topic. It's an active area of a lot
Right.
of research and policy writing. So all of the resources that we've mentioned in the last hour, to my knowledge, they're all free and available on SSRN. Nothing's that we've mentioned is paywalled. It's all out there. There's a ton of great resources from you, Jen, and from others to learn more. And we're just about at time. So I just want to wrap up and say thank you so much. I think everyone who attended knows more now about dark patterns than they did an hour ago, much more. And so a huge thank you to Jen. Awesome. Yes, we got the paper in the chat.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't have a link to it.
Right.
That's the title for those of you who want to look it up.
Yes, excellent paper. And if there's anything you can't find, folks, feel free to reach out to me. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining us during your lunch hour if you're on the West Coast, or in the late afternoon on a Friday if you're on the East Coast, or at night if you're in the EU. And join us next week for a discussion with some guest technical experts on opt-outs, and specifically universal opt-outs and global privacy controls. It's going to be a great conversation. Thank you so much. Any final words you want to leave people with, Jen?
No, thank you. Thank you so
Cool.
much. If anybody
Thank
has
you so much,
questions,
Jen.
want to reach
Yeah.
out to me, please feel free. Happy to hear it.
All right.
And thank you
Thanks,
for all
everyone.
your good work on this topic. Just, wearing our hat as just people who are affected by all this. Like I think collectively appreciate just how much time and energy you've spent on making the world more understandable and hopefully moving the needle on that front. So
Thank you. My next topic is manipulative algorithms. So maybe I'll be back to talk about that eventually.
All right.
We'd love to have you.
Stay tuned,
Okay.
everybody.